from beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. You are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I do appreciate you spending your time with me. Today is someone that I'm delighted to have back on the program, and many of you are familiar with his work. He's an author, professor, speaker, podcaster, and editor of Attack the System, but also just an all-around legitimate and well-informed anarchist. So, Keith, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be back.
Thank you. So today, what I wanted to talk about was something that you and I were speaking about. We get often is that people just don't think an anarchist society has ever existed, or they think that people have tried it and it has failed. But there really is a lot of ignorance around, especially in, if you want to call it the liberty movement, which there's so much ignorance there, but of anarchist societies. And so I wanted to sort of have that conversation with you to maybe inform people about, what has historically been around. And I know there's too much to really cover, but some of the bigger instances, the most significant ones, and then into the modern day of what's going on right now as we speak. So I guess it would be helpful to first define what would an anarchist society or something like that be? How would you define that?
Well, the dictionary definition of anarchism is a society without a state that is based on the principle of voluntary cooperation or voluntary association or voluntary communities. There are some variations in the definitions, but they usually amount to the same basic set of ideas. So, of course, there are many other anarchists that add on all sorts of additional qualifiers about what it takes to be a true anarchist. But the commonly accepted definition of anarchism by political scientists and political philosophers is the philosophy that advocates for the abolition of the state in favor of voluntary society. So that's really the foundation of anarchism. Of course, there's a lot of midway points between the absolutes. If we look at different societies around the world that have existed, we can find examples of anarchistic societies or proto-anarchistic societies. And of course, we have other societies that are based on extreme authoritarianism. Now, most societies that have ever existed were somewhere in the middle. And anarchism takes place whenever people are engaged in voluntary cooperation that's not of a coercive nature. So most people practice anarchism most of the time. When you're just dealing with people in your day-to-day life, you're not threatening people with guns and bombs and that kind of stuff. Well, maybe some people are, but most people are not threatening people with guns and bombs and things like that during the course of their day-to-day business. Now, of course, you can argue there's more subtle forms of coercion. What about things like, an extreme imbalance of economic power and social power and things like that? Those are legitimate questions. But it's interesting to consider how much people actually do practice anarchism.
Yes, I always tell people that, like, when they argue with me and they say, oh, you're an anarchist, well, you just better get ready for your neighbor to come steal your stuff and, rape you or whatever. And I'm like, they don't do that now. Like, laws don't stop people from doing that now. It's because they don't really want to kill each other. Most people want to live in peace and just be left alone to do their own thing. So I think also, like, subsidiarity might be a good sort of definition of what would constitute an anarchist society or a anarchist ideas in ways of governance, maybe. So I think that's a good definition of voluntary cooperation and people figuring out from the bottom up how to govern their own small area. And if there's one mistake I think a lot of libertarians make is thinking that you can just plug and play, basically plug in libertarian politicians in Washington and in the states, and then all of a sudden you'll have this libertarian country, which I think would never work. I don't see any kind of bottom-up governance working for 326 million people at once. It just doesn't work that way. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, well, among more mainstream libertarian types, you have this idea that you can elect a libertarian government or something like that, or have libertarian officials appointed to things. You can get a bunch of libertarians on the Supreme Court or something, and then they're going to legislate libertarianism from the top. I don't know of any kind of society that's ever really worked that way. The problem with ideas like that is that they fail to take into account the nature of power.
Right.
It's really no different than the Marxists who think that, well, if you only centralize control of all wealth into the hands of the state, and as long as you have enlightened people who mean well running things, then everything's going to turn out okay. And this is an idea that's very old. I mean, it goes all the way back to ancient times, that
Sure.
what you really need is enlightened people who hold power, and they'll do the right thing. But I think that's is and always has been a misunderstanding of how power actually works. The first objective of people who hold power is to maintain power, even if that's not their original intent. That will become their intent over time for the purpose of survival. And it's also important to recognize that power comes the easiest to people who want it. People who are content to practice anarchism in their own day-to-day lives most of the time are not people who are out there trying to dominate everyone else's lives, and they're not people who are typically seeking power over other people. Power comes the easiest to people who really want it, and they like being able to wield power over other people, and that's why these kinds of state-centric reformist ideas tend to fail. Whether it's communism or whether it's libertarianism or something else, virtually every philosophy like that has failed whenever it's been implemented, and that's why, because I think it's based on a misunderstanding of the nature of power.
Sure. Yeah, I would agree totally. So I guess where we'll start is with sort of the historic main anarchist, if we will, societies or groups. And I know that Iceland and Ireland are two that most libertarians, even if they're not, knowledgeable about it, they're familiar with those two. But they are, again, those are far in the past. But what could you say about? I know they were actually pretty similar in their structure. And Gerard Casey has done, of course, some amazing work on that with Libertarian Anarchy Against the State and some of his stuff. But there's not a whole lot of people who understand what those societies actually were. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, Iceland and Ireland both existed as quasi-anarchies during the Middle Ages. I think that there are some anarchists and libertarians who exaggerate the anarchistic qualities of some of those societies because they weren't pure anarchy, but they were anarchistic in the sense that you didn't have a monopoly over things like lawmaking.
Mm-hmm.
They were fairly similar to what modern political philosophers call panarchism, which is the idea that you have competing systems of law or authority, not just a monopolistic state-centric system. Now, in Iceland, they did have a legislature that was called the Althing, but the methods of enforcement were competitive. You didn't have anything resembling a modern police force or army or any of that kind of stuff. And a somewhat similar system existed in Ireland as well. And these systems lasted for centuries. They weren't systems that were completely dysfunctional. They lasted for a considerable amount of time. Now, a common argument against holding these up as models of anarchism is the fact that these were agricultural societies, as all pre-modern societies were, and they were also rather densely populated. A question that's raised is, well, could you have a system like that in a modern industrial technological society with millions of people in it, even if you broke down the actual systems of competing law or whatever to a localized level? That's really the question there. But those societies did exist on a very functional level for centuries, and they are an interesting example. There's been some fairly interesting scholarly work done on ancient Ireland and ancient Iceland, well, medieval Ireland and Iceland. Joseph Peden was one. Some decades ago, he did a fairly comprehensive study on Ireland, and David Friedman's writings on Iceland are interesting as well. But those are just a couple of examples. We can actually find a lot of examples from ancient and pre-modern societies that had very similar systems. One thing that most people don't understand is that the state, as we understand it, is actually a fairly modern concept. When we think of the state, we think of this institution that has all of these many agencies and bureaus and organizations. I think the federal government of the United States has something like 400 different agencies or something like that. And that's just the official ones. That doesn't even count all the sub-agencies as well as the secret ones that nobody's supposed to know about. Right. And that, of course, at the state and local level, we find that as well. We find that in other nations as well. But the concept of the public administration state, the idea that the state is responsible for managing everything in society, from charity to education to natural resources to recreation to virtually everything the state is involved in today. That idea really doesn't begin to emerge until the 19th century, and around the same time as the Industrial Revolution. And the state as an institution that has a monopoly over the use of violence. Max Weber was a German social scientist in the early 20th century who said the definition of the modern state was the idea of an institution or organization that has a monopoly on the use of violence. But even the idea of the state as that kind of an organization only goes back to about the 17th century, when after the 30 Years' War concluded in Europe in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. And what the Treaty of Westphalia did was it relegated war-making powers to the king of the state, what they considered to be the state at the time. In older societies, often warfare would be fought by all kinds of groups, everything from families to religions to businesses and pirates and all kinds of people. And there were problems with that as well. But the idea of an institution that has a monopoly over violence is really something that only came about in the early modern period, what historians call the early modern period, which is the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s, the rise of the old absolute monarchists in Europe. And in the ancient world, you had empires that were prototypical states. You had the civilizations that are well known, like Egypt and Babylon, Persia, Sumeria, Rome. All of those were prototypes for modern states in the sense that they were based on a military hierarchy with an official state cult and taxes and slavery and all of that kind of stuff. But so we do see prototypical states in the ancient world, but then the modern state really only emerged in the early modern period. And what we think of as the state, which is the public administration state, is only a couple of centuries old. So it's important to have some historical context on this.
Sure. I want to ask you, something I've talked about with my friend Patrick Smith, who's also a voluntarist, is that it's difficult, it seems, to get a community and even into a society based on secular themes, like around an idea rather than, say, a cultural or a religious idea. Has that ever been the case in the past or present where there's a successful community that's not got like a central theme that most people can agree to before they even move into their public life?
Well, we have to remember that in older societies, virtually all older societies were religion-centered and religion-driven. The idea of separation of church and state or church and government and all of that is a modern concept as well that starts with the Enlightenment. I mean that was true in pagan societies as well as in the Abrahamic religions as well. And all of the ancient pagan societies had state cults. But there are certainly examples of societies that have existed where there was some common theme of a secular nature. Now, sometimes it might be some secular ideology, like people that wanted to practice voluntary communism, or some kind of voluntary ethno-nationalism or ethnocentrism. We can point to examples of that as well. Now, as far as the idea of a voluntary community that doesn't have any kind of unifying ideological theme, we can actually find examples of that in the old American West, when the pioneer settlers were moving westward, they would establish these frontier towns that were often anarchistic by modern standards, in the sense of not really having an organized system of law and government. And these weren't necessarily ideological groups. They weren't like, say, a lot of the early American utopian religious colonies, although there's plenty of examples of those too. But you do have examples of things like pioneer outposts and frontier towns, and prospector communities, like places where they're just going to see if they can dig gold out of the river or something like that. There's plenty of examples like that. Pirates are actually another example.
Sure.
Pirates were actually groups of people that often would internally would seem fairly democratic. A lot of pirate ships actually elected their own leader and things like that. There was a community. There were communities that were formed in the Caribbean and in Central America during the 18th century, called the Maroons. These were groups of runaway slaves that escaped from various slave plantations in North and South America, and they would form their own communities that were, I guess the common theme was they were all escaped slaves, but they weren't some kind of, there wasn't some kind of ideology like, Marxism or, Ayn Randism or something like that, that was unifying them. And they actually engaged in quite a bit of struggle with other societies that wanted to bring them back into the slave system. In fact, there was a guerrilla warfare, a female guerrilla warfare leader. Her name was Fanny, I think was what they called her. But the guerrilla warfare tactics that she developed are still studied in military academies today. She was considered a pioneer in that, just like some of the more well-known pioneers in modern guerrilla warfare theory, like Mao Zedong and some of those kinds of people. You could find plenty of examples of anarchistic or quasi-anarchistic communities that have existed where there wasn't some kind of, ideological commitment, either a political, secular ideology or some kind of religious ideology.
Sure. Oh, interesting. Another thing I heard you speak on, which I thought was quite seems unusual to at least the American mind, is that there was an Islamic anarchist society.
Yeah. Well, communities and sectarian tendencies within Islam. Now, I'm not sure what specific group you're referring to. We could find some examples. Back in the Middle Ages, there was a branch of Shia Islam that was located in the region that we now call Iran. That was they were fairly similar to what's commonly called Christian anarchism. Within the Christian tradition, you have the Christian anarchist tradition. That's some of the more modern thinkers that are associated with that, or Tolstoy and Dorothy Day and people like that. But then you can find prototypes for that go back to the Middle Ages as well, the diggers and levelers and some of that kind of stuff, and some of the utopian religious communes that existed in the Middle Ages. But there were Islamic equivalents of that as well. The Qajarzites were one that was fairly well known. So that may be what you're referring to. I think another thing that you may be thinking of is this wasn't an anarchistic society, but in the Ottoman Empire, which was a monarchy, which controlled the area that we now call the Middle East for about 300 years, from roughly the early 17th century up until World War I. Now, this was a feudal type of society, not anarchism, but you did have these quasi-anarchistic communities that they called malays that were intended for the purpose of granting some degree of autonomy to ethnic and religious minorities. Now, keep in mind the Ottoman Empire was controlled by the Ottoman Turks, and these are Sunni Muslims, and Sharia law was the basis of their legal system. It wasn't quite the same interpretation of the Sharia law we find in, say, Saudi Arabia or somewhere else today. That's a different interpretation of Sharia law, but it was still the Sharia tradition.
Okay.
But they also afforded some degree of autonomy to their religious minorities, like Christians and Jews, Zoroastrians, some of the others of that type, some of these traditional Middle Eastern religious communities, as well as ethnic groups. So what happened is that you would have these subsystems of law within the wider Sharia system, where, say, a Christian community might go by its own, interpretation of what they think Christian law to be, or the Jews, or the Zoroastrians, or whomever. So that's another interesting example of a competing legal system within the same state structure.
Interesting. When I heard that, I was quite surprised. I don't know why. I guess just because of, even though I try not to be, we're all subject to, I guess, the stuff we hear all the time, and you sort of get colored by that, your view on things. So I do know that, a lot of the more radical forms of Islam have come from, Western foreign policy, really, and kind of polarizing people there. So it's really interesting to hear that.
Well, just as an addition to that, in the actual Islamic tradition, you have what are called the people of the book.
Right.
The book, of course, means the Quran, which they, in their tradition, they view the Quran the way the Christians view the Bible. It's the word of God, whatever. But there are other religions that are mentioned in the Quran that are considered predecessors to Islam, that are considered to have sort of opened the door or paved the way for the Prophet Muhammad, like Judaism, like the Sabians, like Christianity, like the Zoroastrians. So in traditional Islamic societies, typically those religious communities were regarded as the people of the book, meaning, well, they're not really on the right page with us because we're the Muslims, and that's the one true faith of the final revelation. But they're still, in the club to some degree because they're still people of the book. It's the same kind of view that a lot of Christians today have of the Jews. They say, well, they don't believe in Jesus, but they're still in the Bible, so they're still okay.
Sure.
So and now the ideas that Americans have about Muslims as these crazed terrorists who cut people's heads off and stuff like that. I mean, all that is that's the Islamic world's version of stuff like abortion clinic bombers, or like white supremacist terrorists that go shoot up a synagogue or something like that. Now, there is an interpretation of Islam that's very fanatical and very cult-like. It's called Salafism, that has its roots in the 19th century, and it also overlaps with some other similar versions of Islam, Wahhabism, Qutbism, and some others, and these are predominant in Saudi Arabia. And so, but it's, I don't want to digress too much into Islam, but a lot of Americans have a really distorted view of what Islam is, because it's only filtered through, what they hear on Fox News, or, what they see going on as far as terrorism and things like that.
Right. I'm certainly no expert. I have listened to a few lectures by Muslims on Islam and what it actually is, and it seems to be more, almost more secular in a way, secularly concerned with justice and rights of different peoples and things like that. It's quite different in my way of thinking, anyways. And of course, like I said, I'm no expert, but it definitely doesn't seem to be exactly what it's portrayed in the States, for sure.
It's like Christianity. Within Christianity, you've got pacifists like the Quakers and the Brethren and churches like that. And then you've got, fascist militias like the Phalangists and things like that used to carry out massacres in Lebanon and those places. So you've got the whole spectrum of things.
Yeah. Interesting side note. All these things that are important to the kinds of societies, though, that people do live in, because I think the more, like you said before, power comes easiest to those people who want it. And I know Gerald Casey has talked about in his book, Libertarian Anarchy, how, the beginning was people were living in, mostly nomadic and doing their thing. And then the thugs of the groups realized that they could basically domesticate other people and live off of those, what we would call probably the political elite at this point. They just live off of the domestication of other humans, and they build these systems. And I say they as if there was this, hindsight intent that they had. They knew where they were going, but it's more interest driven, and it develops into these systems where then the people take on that yoke of government themselves and think that, well, this is the way things operate, and the reason is because it's best for us. So it's sort of this strange idea.
Yeah, well, there's been some great work in anthropology on the origins of the state. Some of the best work comes from a guy named James Scott, who was a political science, well, an anthropologist at, I think he's at Yale, somewhere like that. But anyway, yeah, he's done a lot of research on the actual anthropological origins of the state. And what he found is exactly what you're saying, that the state has started to emerge when largely when permanent human settlements began to develop after horticulture and pastoralism, and then agriculture became possible. And the state developed largely just through different bands of raiders going out and plundering other raiders and enslaving the people they conquered. And of course, that's how they got to monopolize land and agricultural production. And that's how slavery developed. And that's how what we call taxes or paying tribute developed. And then out of that came a hereditary system of rule where the ruler, the biggest warlord or whatever, would pass his kingdom down to his sons or whomever. And then, of course, they brought the religion in where they would create a state cult that deified the emperor as the descendant of the sun god. And so, that's why he gets his position, because he's a god or something like that. That really defines the history of the state fairly well. That's how ancient states develop, and those that has spilled over into modern times. I mean, when the monotheistic religions became dominant, in monotheism you can't have a human god like the emperor. So then you just have come up with the idea of the divine right of kings. Well, okay, the king rules because he's God's appointed representative. And the whole idea of democracy and the will of the people and all of that kind of stuff is the modern version of that. And when secular thinking came to dominate political philosophy, they simply came up with new ideas to legitimize the state. One is the idea of the social contract,
right?
That Hobbes popularized, and then there's addition to that was the idea of the protective state, that the state exists to protect your rights, like John Locke and some of that. And then the idea of the general will that Jean-Jacques Rousseau formulated. And most all modern political philosophy is based on that idea to some degree. And then, of course, you have the modern totalitarian ideologies, which say that the state is simply an expression of the organic culture or the class power or something like that. Now, I would say that the modern totalitarianism was really just a reinvention of the ancient idea of the God King. I mean, if you look at someone like Kim Jong-un, for example, and compare him with the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and Roman emperors, it's the same thing. It's this guy who is really just a gang leader, but he's worshipped as a god by his followers and stuff like that. So it really hasn't changed much in about 5,000 years.
Yeah, I think important to note too that countries aren't nations, and that like a nation can be just a small cultural unit. I've read somewhere once that the United States is made up of 11 separate cultural groups that you could call nations. I think there are probably even more than that, but that's a nation, and I think that sort of deals with the twisting of patriotism. So I think people have like a normal, natural love of place, love of where they come from, and that's sort of been really twisted into this kind of jingoist, violent love of country that it just seems to be out of hand. I don't know if you have any comments on that. It's just a aside again.
Well, the original meaning of something like nationalities or ethnic groups or whatever was based on language. That was really the defining characteristic of a particular nationality, people who speak the same language, as much as being from the same place or having the same skin color and things like that. Those were usually overlapping characteristics. But the root of ethnoculture is language. So you have all sorts of different language families that out of which different ethnic groups emerged. So that's really the first idea that you find when it comes to the idea of nations. But ethnic groups, the idea of ethnic groups has always existed, since ancient times. Although nationalism, the way it's understood in modern times, which is the idea of you have the nation state, you have a state that's the manifestation of a particular nation, whatever the nation is. Usually it's defined as some sort of geographical territory. and a state that rules over it, and then it might be considered to have certain characteristics like language or culture or religion or ethnicity or something like that. But nationalism, again, is another modern idea. It's something that originates really from the French Revolution. This may sound incongruous to a lot of people because people today tend to think of nationalism as being a right-wing idea. They tend to think of the French Revolution as being a prototypical left-wing revolution. But in the French Revolution, one of the things that came out of that was that France, prior to the revolution, had been a collection of provinces, some of which had their own language, or at least their own dialect of French. Mm-hmm. One of the things the French revolutionaries wanted to do was unify France under this common French identity with a common language, with the French, some kind of official French language would be the unifying language. And that's really how we got a lot of the modern nation states. That's how we got Germany. That's how we got Italy. The idea of, in the 19th century, of nationalism emerged because prior to that, the societies tended to be ruled by dynastic empires. It wasn't about any nationality or anything like that. It was about these royal families and who often intermarried. So you might have the prince of one from one region married the princess from some other region, and then they would try to combine their dynasties, but then their dynasties would actually include multiple ethnic and cultural and linguistic groups. So out of the Enlightenment, out of the French Revolution and all that, when these old royal systems started to lose their legitimacy and decline, you started to see the rise of nationalism, this idea that people that share a common ethnic or national or cultural identity should have some unitary state of their own. Usually it was language. Usually language was probably the more common unifying thing than any of the other things. Mm. But the idea was to have, say, a unitary state for all German speakers, or a unitary state for all Italian speakers or French speakers or whatever. And that's really the beginning of modern nationalism, the idea of a unitary but independent state for people sharing these common characteristics. But that's a very modern idea.
Sure. I do remember reading before on, say, Tolkien and some of his contemporaries that, he wanted to write a mythology for the Germanic peoples so that they had a cultural mythology that they could kind of rally around, and English being a Germanic language, and sort of in the same family there. But anyways, that's another digression. It's always, I find that really, really interesting, that emphasis on language, and that there seems to be a de-emphasis on that now. And I don't know if that's actually true in academia, but it seems to be true amongst people that language doesn't have the same unifying effect, or they speak, English like we do, or they speak, although you do, maybe I'm wrong, because you hear that in sort of these people who don't like illegals, they'll talk about Mexicans and they don't even speak English, And so I guess it's a very human thing to sort of separate each other by that.
Yeah, well, as far as the language, you don't see as much division over language nowadays because societies are more multilingual. In Europe, for example, every European country has its own indigenous language for the most part, but then they've also adopted English as something of a lingua franca. I mean, you can go to an ATM machine in a major European city, and sometimes you can get your choice of a dozen languages. Yeah. But yeah, that doesn't really seem to be a divisive force the way it once was. It seems to be more rooted in just wider cultural conflict. Like you were saying, that people complain about, well, the Hispanic people don't know English, or Right. They want to speak Spanish instead. Some years ago, I haven't heard much about this lately, but some years ago, there was a move to actually make English the official Right. language of the United States. Which, I mean, I used to always say to people who were in favor of that, I always say, look, there are countries around the world where they have 5 official languages. Yeah. In Switzerland, you can go to a town meeting and they will be speaking 3 different languages with interpreters.
Yeah, I think India has a couple, I know it's at least 100, separate, like, recognized state languages. So there may be even more than that, but it's...
There are 700 in Indonesia, yeah.
Wow. It's incredible. It's amazing we can even talk to each other at all. But okay, so to get back to the task at hand here with the communities, I wanted to talk a little bit too about some of the more utopian colonies of the you know early America. One that I know of is the is it Oneida? They make silverware now, but that was their business that came out of that utopian community, and they were like so many of them seem to incorporate a few principles like free love um, and like a utilitarianism or equitable sharing of goods to those who have needs and so can you speak a little bit on that and that it seemed to be like there was a huge movement of people doing that at one point.
Yeah, well, in early America, in the colonial period, as well as in the 19th century, in the pioneer period, you had a lot of different kinds of people trying to form these utopian colonies, and there was a lot of reasons for that. A lot of these were groups that came from England, many of which were, or from Europe, many of which were persecuted by various European states for, having unusual religious beliefs or being heretics, or some of them were pacifists and they wouldn't serve in the military, so that's why they got run out of, say, Prussia and places like that. That's how we got the Amish in the United States. They were refugees from Prussia. In fact, the reason they don't wear mustaches is because the Prussian military officers were known for these big, bushy mustaches. But you had a lot of also because America was a pioneer society at the time. It was a place where people would go to set up new colonies and new worlds and that kind of stuff. You had a lot of people that would try to create these experimental utopian societies, and this was started to blend into the rise of early socialism. Early socialism in the early 19th century wasn't what we think of as being socialism today. When we think of socialism, we think of things like the Soviet Union, things like a state that controls all wealth under a command economy, and it's basically just a military dictatorship where theoretically everyone's supposed to be equal. But that's not what early socialism was. Early socialism was more about these kind of utopian colonies and things like that, cooperatives and these sorts of things.
Would you say one was tied to the government and another was just tied to how people decided to live together?
Yeah. Well, the idea was often to share and share alike. You had people that believed in communal utopias. Right. You had others that were more about religion. You had others that were more about, back to the land, or when the Industrial Revolution developed, you had people that were opposed to industrialization, and they thought it was eradicating the traditional farming, agricultural, rural way of life. So you had that kind of utopianism. There were a lot of different kinds of themes to these things. But there were many of them. I mean, there were too many of them to mention. A lot of them had very sectarian religious views, some of which a lot of people would think were really strange. Some weren't. Some were more secular, more proto-socialist. New Harmony was one that was founded by an Englishman named Robert Owen. But those were all over the place, and it's interesting how some of those have developed into prototypical townships and stuff like that now as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember there's one that was started by spiritualists, and I think it's still around. I can't remember the name of it right now, but as far as I know,
I know which one you're talking about. I can't remember the name offhand either.
Yeah, so that definitely is something that is not your typical American fare for religion. So it seems like it's a lot of times a way for people to self-segregate into, groups of people that live like they do, which to me sounds ideal. Whereas most people prefer to live around people that are like them in some way, whatever way it is, ideologically or race or whatever. And I think while I wouldn't agree with all of their ideas, I think that's certainly the better way for people to be able to separate themselves out, and then there's less violence in the world. So I think that's the sort of the idea of subsidiarity, right? Where you have people in a certain small geographical area that govern themselves with however they decide to do that. To me, it matters a lot less than the fact that they can do that. Whereas, I guess for dissent is the real right. When you're free if you can dissent and move on. It doesn't mean you can continue living in the same place, but you can at least leave it. Whereas when people say to me, well, if you don't like it, why don't you leave? And okay, well, give me the $10,000 that it takes to do that, and maybe I will. But you just can't. I don't have the right to just leave. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I am an anarchist is because I do think that it's best that institutions are localized and decentralized enough that if you don't like what's going on around you, exit costs are low enough to make love it or leave it into a viable option.
right.
Back during the Vietnam War period, a lot of anti-war protesters would get that from hawks. They'd say, well, America, love it or leave it, which, I mean, it's a bit difficult to migrate to a whole different country. I mean, it's easier now than it used to be, but it's still pretty difficult. But the more localized or social organization tends to be, the easier it is to migrate elsewhere. A parallel issue with that, this is an important point because this is something that gets brought up a lot. When it comes to the issue of racism in the United States and American history, one thing that tends to give ideas like decentralization or localism a bad name is because a lot of people identify that with things like the idea of states' rights being a code word for segregation and that kind of stuff. But it's actually the case that in 19th century and early 20th century America, you would actually have independent towns that formed that were black-led and organized towns. There was a famous writer. Her work is still studied in English classes and anthropology classes and in the universities today. Zora Neale Hurston. She was a part of what's called the Harlem Renaissance. So there's a very prominent African-American anthropologist and writer from the 1920s is when she did most of her work. But she actually grew up in a place called Eatonville, Florida, which was an all-black town. This was in the late, I guess it would have been in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when segregation and all of that kind of stuff was at its peak in the United States. But this was actually an independent town that had a black mayor. Her father was actually the mayor. As well as its own black police force and all of that. So this was a situation where people that were despised and persecuted by the wider society were able to create a prosperous, autonomous community for themselves, even in the midst of everything else that was going on.
Yeah, I think about the Black Panthers and their, while I don't agree with their, sort of economical stance, there is a lot to learn from that movement. And one of the things was they were taking care of their own communities. They were within the cities. There were black communities that were feeding black children and schooling black children. And I don't see the problem with that as long as the violence, it was a protectionist stance, though, clearly. They wanted to protect themselves from the rampant racism. And I know, I think my producer always tells me that the first gun legislation of any substance was done in California because, and I think Reagan was the governor then, because the Black Panthers went to the state house with their guns. And so we can't have scary black people with guns, so we've got to regulate that. Yeah. So yeah. I think there's a lot of good things to learn from that. And of course, people always, I've been accused of supporting racists because of that. But I honestly don't think if you have a community where you are cut off from the wider world and you're not going to trade, you're not going to do anything but with those of your own kind, if you will, as far as race, you're probably not going to last very long. I think those kinds of societies either adapt or change. Adapt or die. They don't generally stick around. It seems to me it just wouldn't work out. So why do I care? Let them go off and be in their own little weird area, and as long as they're leaving everybody else alone. I don't see it as a wide, like most people would do that. I don't really believe most people are racist. So,
yeah, well, the Black Panthers were not a separatist or supremacist group. They were actually Marxists in their ideology, to the degree they had one. But they actually created a group called a larger federation called the Rainbow Coalition that included similar groups for other ethnic groups. You had what was called the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican group, and the Brown Berets, which was a Mexican American group, what they used to call Chicanos. They had one called the Red Guards, which was a Chinese American group, and you had the White Panthers, which was basically a counterculture type of group. Huh. And there was also the Young Patriots, and these were poor whites that had migrated from Appalachia to the Chicago area. and they actually had the Confederate flag as one of their symbols. But they were part of this wider federation with the Black Panthers. But I tell you, the Black Panthers that organized the Rainbow Coalition, Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, they were considered to be so threatening that they were actually assassinated by the government.
Right.
The FBI and the Chicago police conspired to assassinate them, which usually in the United States, when somebody is considered to be a political threat, they may try to, if it comes to it, they usually try to discredit them simply through propaganda, through vilification, through
Right.
economic discrimination. If it comes down to it, they may try to frame them on some kind of criminal charges or get them on some kind of trumped up charge or something like that. But it's actually not that common that the American government carries out domestic assassinations against dissidents. But this was a case where they did, because they found these guys to be so threatening.
Wow. I think the church hearings in the 70s, early 80s, maybe, it sort of exposed
1973, 74.
Okay. That exposed that sort of, that for one, Hoover was just insane, and he was specifically worried about the Black Panthers, but also Martin Luther King, and I don't know if Malcolm X was part of that hearing as well, but I know that those people were considered huge threats to him and to white America and all the values that he believed that stood for. And so they actually would put agent provocateurs in there. And I remember one instance of that they had put they had made up coloring books that portrayed police officers as pigs, as actual pigs, and so they gave them to the Black Panthers, and then they used that as evidence. Look, these people, they hate the police, and so they're scary. It was just incredible. But anyways, so that sort of group, I think, is a good example of a modern group that wanted to just kind of take care of their own business and be left alone, and inside of the larger state. But we were talking about utopian colonies. Also, I wanted to mention the Iroquois Federation or Confederation. That was sort of a similar, like a confederation of tribes that sort of worked together under an umbrella, but it wasn't forced necessarily.
Yeah. It was, the Iroquois Confederation was simply a federation of Native American groups or indigenous groups. It existed throughout mostly the northern region of what's now the United States. It was actually in part influential in developing the whole concept of federalism in the United States that the United States was supposed to be based on as well, because that was actually an influence on some of the thinking of the founders of the United States, as well as plenty of other things. But among indigenous communities, though, you actually find quite a few examples of this among the Iroquois or among a number of other Native Americans, but also among indigenous people in Africa and West Africa in particular, in Polynesia, the South Pacific. You find all of these kinds of prototypical, proto-anarchistic arrangements. There's one region today that's still around it's called Zomia, and it's in the I guess Southeast Asia. Is roughly in between, say, Laos, Vietnam, and China, Thailand, Malaysia, or not Malaysia. In that Southeast Asian region, there's this very vast hill country where there's about 20 million people that live there, and it's still an agricultural society. It's not an industrial society, but the state has never been able to penetrate that area. There's really never been the government there or the state the way it's understood, even though it's always been surrounded by states. And that has to do with the geography, because the geography is very difficult to penetrate. But you do have about 20 million people that are indigenous to that region that are still there, living without a state in an agricultural society.
Very interesting. I know there are many indigenous groups as well that still haven't even had contact with the wider world. So
there's about 100 of those. Yeah, there's about 100 of them.
It's incredible. Like I can't even imagine, but that is quite incredible that still in our world where we tend to view it as so small. And if you believe some people overpopulated, which I don't believe that clearly I don't see how that could even be possible if that's the case. But it's quite amazing that people are still living in ways they've lived for thousands of years and being left alone to do it. It's pretty great. So I wanted to move into a little bit of the more modern. Before the show, you and I were talking about. Close to me, I know of two. Which is the Farm, which was sort of started as a countercultural from the Haight-Ashbury type hippie movement that's still going strong in Summertown, Tennessee. They were one of the choices. I almost chose them for my umbrella school in homeschooling in Tennessee here. Some people are familiar with. And then there's, I forget what the name of the group is, but they're the Gay fairies, is that what they call them? No, radical fairies. Yeah, that's gay fairies. Radical fairies that are only like an hour from me in DeKalb County. So there are still, and it's one that we hadn't really thought about too much, but that I know many anarcho-capitalists will be familiar with, is Acapulco, where a lot of voluntarists and anarcho-capitalists live. And there's, of course, Anarchapulco down there, but that is also a sort of quasi-anarchist society there, correct? There was where you were talking about the problems they had sort of overthrown the government. There's a lot of little cities that have overthrown their government in Mexico, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, in Mexico, Mexico comes pretty close to being a failed state, and in the sense that because of the chaos that's happened there, from everything from guerrilla insurgencies to the drug cartels and all of that, it's been very difficult for the Mexican government to maintain control. So what has happened is you've had all these communities that have emerged that have largely expelled the Mexican government and the police and all of that from their own communities. Now, the most well-known example is in the Chiapas region, which is in southern Mexico. You have these places that are largely under the control of the Zapatistas, the EZLN, which is an indigenous peoples, guerrilla revolutionary group or something like that. But they're organized kind of on the model of libertarian socialism with anarcho-communists and people like that envision. But there's also a lot of other areas of Mexico, different towns and cities and places like that, small cities, where that are largely anarchistic as well. One of the well-known examples is Sharon. It's a city that's mostly inhabited by native people, where they kicked out the cops, they kicked out the government, they kicked out the drug cartels, and it's largely been self-organized based on their own indigenous traditions and things like that. But there's a lot of examples of that in Mexico. Now, in Acapulco, the group around Jeff Berwick, who's a well-known anarcho-capitalist, they have an expatriate community there. Acapulco still has a government, although not much of one. I've been there myself. It's the city. It's divided by a mountain range, and on the coastal side of the mountain range is a touristy area. We have a lot of expatriates from North America who live there, from the States and Canada. And then on the other side is the more poor people's region, and that's actually controlled by a drug cartel. That's an interesting place because, it's pretty wide open. Although it's certainly, the state's presence is certainly there. One thing they had a trouble with was they didn't want the police, the municipal police in Acapulco, or the cartels to bother the tourists, because the tourists are so important to the economy in terms of revenue and things like that. So you actually have the federales, who are the Mexican army there, stationed in Acapulco to police the police. So you can actually walk down the street and see a guy with an AK-47 standing on a street corner, and you can go up to these guys and talk to them and take a selfie with them and things like that. Wow. But if you speak enough Spanish to ask them while they're there, they'll tell you, we're here to watch the cops, or we're here to watch the cartels.
If only.
What?
I said, if only.
Yeah. Well, yeah. They had trouble at one point with the municipal police were constantly harassing tourists, trying to shake them down for bribes and things like that. At one point, the city police in Acapulco went on strike, so the municipal government of Acapulco fired them. They fired the entire police force. Wow. And got another one. So yeah, it's a pretty messy place. But Acapulco is not some kind of utopia.
Right.
It's actually has about the highest murder rate of any city in the world. It's like 4 times the murder rate of Chicago.
Wow.
so it's a pretty dangerous place. I mean, it's not if you don't mess with the wrong people, but it's you can get into some bad stuff there. But you do find all over the world, though, you do find examples of where a failed state may take place, a state that can't really hold its position, and then out these kinds of organic, or what Friedrich von Hayek calls spontaneous order will emerge, where people start taking things into their own hands and they start organizing these communities of their own. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not, but you can find plenty of examples of that.
Yeah, there was one that I had heard mentioned is in Greece, and it came out of the riots of the sort of collapse there. And I think that's still, it's more like a neighborhood, correct?
It's called Exarchia.
Exarchia.
Greece had some uprisings, I guess, probably about 8-9 years ago.
Yeah.
In response to the economic downturn that was going on there. And what happened is that you started having groups of radicals that would carve out their own little communities. And in this region, in this area of Athens called Exarchia. And it's a quasi-anarchist. It's really more like a neighborhood, more like an enclave or something like that. Like the Lower East Side in New York or someplace like that, or like Haight-Ashbury. It's controversial because there's a lot of disorder that goes on there too. People urinating in the street and stuff like that. It's like people who like this kind of clean, bourgeois type of lifestyle probably wouldn't care for it. But it's another example of a community that's largely existing as sort of an independent community within a state framework.
That's interesting that you would say that. And there seems to me to be, and of course I've only been an anarchist for 4 years probably, so I'm still learning a lot about it. But it seems to me that you have the people, say, out of maybe the 80s punk scene or whatever, that are they call themselves anarchists, but they're really not ideologically anarchists. They're just people who don't want to live by any rules. So that's sort of something they've adopted to say, but that's what most people would associate anarchism with, is sort of these, feral people, really, squatters and
yeah, well, you do have people who who are anarchists who live like that. I'd rather they be that than be a lot of other things.
Right.
So I can't criticize them so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's always been that in anarchist circles. There was actually a pamphlet written back in the early 20th century by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Fabrigi. Something like that. Yeah, I'm probably butchering the name, but he had the pamphlet was actually called Bourgeois Influences on Anarchism, and this was, of course, these were anarcho-communists, far left anarchists, and he was saying that that one thing that actually drew a lot of people to anarchism was that they believed the state's propaganda about what anarchism is. Like you had the state saying, well, these anarchist people over here, they just think everything should be chaos and disorder and total rebellion around the clock and things like that. So you would actually have people that are attracted to that would find their way into anarchist groups. Right. Of course, now there's also a tradition within anarchism called illegalism that does glorify that kind of stuff. The idea of, the only true anarchist is somebody that makes their living through armed robbery or bank robbery or something like that.
Yeah,
it's always been there.
I don't know. I guess I'm too bougie for that. I'm a person who loves manners as well, so that doesn't really appeal to me. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of round this out. I know we've kind of gotten off into different little rabbit trails, but that's great. I think you're always so able to go just about anywhere. I wanted to talk about the idea of collapsitarianism. And there are a lot of people who will say, well, I'm a collapsitarian, and so I just want to bankrupt and force the state to fail so that we can start over, like that we can start over. Who is the we that we're going to start over with is what I want to know. And I worry about that sort of ideal because to me it's sort of on the same level as a violent revolution. People that want to go and violently overthrow the government and think that they're going to somehow end up in power and able to right all the wrongs, which will not happen, honestly. I think the anarchists are less than 1% of the population, probably less than 0.5%. So that's not going to happen. And Republicans are not our friends, people. So, there's not going to be this big movement of freedom. So what do you think about collapsitarianism?
Well, like a lot of other belief systems, I think they overstate their case. The idea behind collapsitarianism, of course, is that, well, society is just going to collapse, and out of this, a new dawn will emerge. A lot of the examples that are used to support this idea range from the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire, in the 4th century, or the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. What people who argue for this typically don't point out is that societies that experience that usually go down the tubes pretty quick. If what came after the Western Roman Empire in Europe, well, we had the Dark Ages when illiteracy and all of that kind of stuff became rampant. Right. What happened to the Soviet Union after it fell apart? Well, what was 1990s Russia like? Life expectancy, the average life expectancy dropped by 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union during the Yeltsin period in the 90s in Russia. So I don't know that those are really models that anybody would want to draw on. I think a better idea is to advocate for expanding the realm of voluntary cooperation. And that includes things like proliferation of the kinds of communities that we're talking about. I think it's more important to have a positive model in terms of something you want to actually organize and create, or some particular goals you want to establish, rather than saying, well, let's just level everything and see what comes next. That usually some of the most dystopian, dysfunctional societies that there've ever been were things that actually emerged from situations like that. Typically what happens is that you'll have a society that's destroyed either by war or by persistent civil unrest or total economic failure. And that's when you start really seeing the cockroaches come out of the baseboards. A good example, a well-known example, is the Third Reich. The Third Reich came out of the ruins of Germany, out of what happened to Germany in World War I, where Germany was totally destroyed, and then the failure of the Weimar Republic, and during the period of the Great Depression and all of that. Another example is the way that the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan after Afghanistan had been torn apart for 20 years of war with the Soviet Union and the Civil War prior to that. The way that the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia became dominant was after Cambodia had been destroyed during the Vietnam War, largely through American bombing. So the idea of a utopian society of some kind emerging from a failed society completely fails. While certainly you can find examples of that. I was talking earlier about how in failed states, you might sometimes have these communities that emerge out of that are successful, like some of these places in Mexico. But when an entire society collapses, you don't generally have happy results. It's not like, well, okay, great, we got rid of this bad old system and now we can build this new utopia. Yeah. What happens is usually the opposite. Usually you just have complete cultural and economic and intellectual regression, or the cockroaches start coming out of the woodwork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like that when people are living in a society that has failed like that they're really mostly concerned with their own survival, not with building the great new thing. Like, they're just concerned with living day to day, and that's where you get a lot of this, terrible things that happen, because then they're more able to be taken advantage of, because I think fear is probably the greatest motivator of people. I know a lot of people would like it to be love. I wish that were the case, but I think when people are afraid, they tend to accept things that they would never do when they're not living and based on fear and if they're going to survive.
Well, it's basic psychology. I mean, anybody that's taken a Psychology 101 class can tell you about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's the idea that physical security is the first one. Right. It's just like in combat. If somebody that's been in military combat will say, well, ordinary ethics and all of that goes out the window. It's just all about survival, kill or be killed. That's just how it works. And people that are accustomed to living in a society like that, that's the kind of value system that they adopt, and that's what people tend to go for when survival becomes a primary issue. That's threatened. When actual social change happens of a constructive nature, usually is in a situation where liberalization starts after a lengthy period of repression.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a society that has experienced a fairly lengthy period of repression, you'll start to see some cracks emerging in that, and then people will start demanding more and more change or reforms or whatever. That's the real model of how social change tends to happen, not when you typically just ravage the existing society and try to build some kind of utopia from scratch.
Sure. I think while we're wrapping things up here, do you have any suggestions as to what people can do to sort of be more anti-state in their lives? I know for me, agorism would probably be the most, biggest example that people could just kind of stop using the system in the way that it is right now. But do you even proffer any ideas like that? Or
Yeah, well, building alternative infrastructure is important. Because right now in the United States, for example, we actually have a situation where the majority of people are dependent on the state in some way, or recipients of state benefits or in state employment or of some kind. So that's something to consider. Has to be something in the place of the state to take its place that provides things that people need. Now, there's all kinds of examples of alternative infrastructure where you do have organizations that do provide for their own members' needs and things like that. Including some from different parts of the world that are fairly sophisticated. But that really, I think, is the way that you have to go about fighting the state. You have to build alternatives that can exist and be in place when the state does fall, or where people simply don't need the state anymore. There's an organization called the Startup Societies Foundation that I think is interesting. I don't belong to it personally, or I don't speak for them, but they have this idea of creating alternative model societies that actually have their own institutional structures that do meet their own needs in this way. These are not ideological groups. They're about organization rather than ideology. There's a lot of examples you can find of people that are actually doing that in different places, but that's really the key. You see prototypes of that in all areas of life. I mean, there's all kinds of groups and organizations that people belong to that aren't part of the state directly, that meet some kind of need beyond what the state is providing. So the idea is to become less dependent on the state through expanding voluntary organizations of that type as well.
Great. Yeah. And so also, do you recommend if people want to know any more about, have you personally written about this? Or do you recommend anything that people can read to sort of understand the subject better and maybe the histories of some of these societies?
Well, there's a lecture that I gave at a conference in London last year that's available on YouTube. It's called, I think it's called Anarchist Communities, Past, Present, and Future. It's about an hour or so long. It's just a YouTube video where I'm actually giving a very comprehensive overview of different kinds of communities like we've been talking about that have existed historically, everything from the Utopian religious colonies to Ireland and Iceland and the communities in Mexico I was talking about, and ancient Islamic anarchists and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of material in that. I go over a lot of stuff. And even in that, I actually had to skip over a lot of stuff because, I only had so much time to talk about it. So I actually left a lot of stuff out I could have included.
Sure.
But the models are there. The models are there. There's all kinds of examples of historic communities that existed for a long time without an overarching state, that were voluntary or at least localized societies where migration was easy by, if you didn't like where you were, you could go somewhere else. There's all sorts of quasi-anarchist communities that have existed in all different kinds of contexts, and in pre-modern and in modern societies as well, all over the world, in many different kinds of cultural forms. One thing that I've heard some people say is that, well, anarchism could only exist in certain kinds of cultural contexts.
Right.
For example, if it's, say if it's, only a society that's shaped by the Western Enlightenment, classical liberalism would be suitable for anarchism. Only an agricultural society, or only a very wealthy society. Or there's different renditions of this idea. But you can actually find quasi-anarchistic communities that have existed in all kinds of contexts. Some were industrial societies, some were agricultural societies, some were religious, some were secular, and from all the different regions of the world. Places like Korea, China, India, a lot of Russia. A lot of different kinds of examples.
Great. And where can people find you, Keith? All your stuff. I know you're at attackthesystem.com, and anywhere else that you have stuff going out, or radio shows?
Just Google my name. Just Google my name, and you'll find all kinds of stuff. You can find books that I've written. You can go to the website attackthesystem.com, and there's a bunch of old podcasts there, and links to information about books that I've written, probably hundreds of essays I've written on these topics. There's something like 10,000 posts on that site, because that site's been up for about 20 years. So it's, there's a lot of material on that. But more than that, just if you go online and Google my name, you can find what people who don't like me say about me as well. You can check all that out. You can go on YouTube. You can find the interviews I've done with a lot of different people, talks I've gave, things like that. So I'm all over the place.
Great, thanks. Well, it was really great having you, and I appreciate you coming on the show. And I look forward to maybe discussing something else again. I think the historical perspective and the social perspective are really good ones to have in anytime you're dealing with an ideal such as anarchism, because people just can't fathom it. It's really difficult for most people, your average Joe walking down the street in the United States, to fathom anarchism, and it's good to know a lot of different things. We have to know a lot more than most people just to communicate our ideas to people, it seems like, because they're so, they seem so aberrant to people, and I know a lot of that is just bad press in a way, so...
Well, it's interesting to consider, some of the very lay level arguments you hear. Things like, well, if with anarchism, everybody will kill everybody else. Right. Well, what's interesting about that is even in the state dominated system we have, the clearance rate on murder is only about 2/3 in the United States, meaning that 1 in 3 murderers gets away with it in the United States. Yeah. And the clearance rate on all other crimes, armed robbery, rape, burglary, all of that is below 50%. So criminals get away with it most of the time.
Right. But the government stops that, right? The police stop that. Well, on that note, since I always like to get a good jab in at the police, that's it for us today. You can certainly catch me here on the Sherry Voluntary Show, also on YouTube, also Stitcher, SoundCloud, any of the places that podcasts are done. And if you are so inclined, the local radio station here, 92.3 FM, I'm on most Tuesdays. This week it will be Friday, but you can catch that on Facebook as well, and I always post that to my page. And if you would like to support this endeavor financially, you can go to patreon.com at /Sherry Voluntary, and that would be much appreciated. So until next time, peace.